Dracula by Bram Stoker, Chapter 21, Dr. Seward's Diary, continued.
I heard the dogs bark behind our house, but not where he was.
As he spoke, Van Helsing's eyes never blinked, but his hand came out and met mine and gripped it hard. He did not, however, betray himself. He nodded slightly and said, "Go on." In a low voice, Renfield proceeded.
He came up the window in the mist, as I had seen him often before, but he was solid then, not a ghost, and his eyes were fierce like a man's when angry. He was laughing, his red mouth, the sharp white teeth glinted in the moonlight when he turned back over the belt of trees to where the dogs were barking. I wouldn't ask him to come in at first, though I knew he wanted to, just as he had wanted all along. Then he began promising me things, not in words, but by doing them.
He was interrupted by a word from the professor. How?
By making them happen. Just as he used to send in flies when the sun was shining, great big fat ones with steel and sapphire on their wings, and big moths in the night with skull and crossbones on their backs.
Van Helsing nodded to him as he whispered to me unconsciously. The Acherontia tropos of the Sphinx, what you call the death's head moth. The patient went on without stopping.
Then he began to whisper, "Rats, rats, rats, hundreds, thousands, millions of them, and every one alive, and dogs to eat them, and cats too, all lives, all red blood with years of life in it, not merely buzzing flies." I laughed at him, for I wanted to see what he could do. Then the dogs howled, and away beyond the dark trees of his house, he beckoned me to the window. I got up and looked out, and he raised his hands and seemed to call out without using any words. A dark mass spread over the grass, coming on like the shape of a flame of fire, and then he moved the mist to the right and left. I could see there were thousands of rats, with their eyes blazing red like his, only smaller. He held up his hand, and they all stopped. And I thought he seemed to be saying, "All these lives I will give you, aye, and many more and greater, though countless ages, if you will fall down and worship me." And then a red cloud like the color of blood seemed to close over my eyes, and before I knew what I was doing, I found myself opening the sash and saying to him, "Come in, Lord and Master." The rats were all gone, but he slid into the room through the sash, though it was only open an inch wide, just as the moon herself has often come in through the tiniest crack and has stood before me in all her size and splendor.
His voice was weaker, so I motioned his lips with the brandy again, and he continued, but it seemed as though his memory had gone on working in the interval, for his story was further advanced. I was about to call him back to the point, but Van Helsing whispered to me, "Let him go on. Do not interrupt him. He cannot go back, maybe could not proceed at all at once if we lost the thread of his thought." He proceeded.
"All day I waited to hear from him, and he did not send anything, not even a blowfly. And when the moon got up, I was pretty angry with him. When he slid in through the window, though it was shut, and did not even knock, I got mad with him. He sneered at me, and his white face looked out through the mist with his red eyes, gleaming, and he seemed as though he owned the whole place, and I was no one. He didn't even smell the same as he went by me. I told him I thought that somehow Mrs. Harker had come into the room."
The two men sitting on the bed stood up and came over, standing beside him so that he could not see them, but they could hear. They were both silent, but the professor started and quivered. His face, however, grew grimmer and sterner still. Renfield went on without noticing.
"When Mrs. Harker came to see me this afternoon, she wasn't the same. It was like tea after the teapot had been watered."
Here we all moved, but no one said a word. He went on.
"I didn't know that she was here till she spoke, and she didn't look the same. I don't care for pale people. I like them with lots of blood in them, and hers had all seemed to run out. I didn't think of it at the time, but when she went away I began to think, and it made me mad to know that he had been taking the life out of her.
I could feel the rest quivered, as I did, but we remained otherwise still.
So when he came tonight I was ready for him. I saw the mist stealing in and I grabbed it tight. I heard the madmen have unnatural strength, and as I knew I was a madman, at times anyhow, I resolved to use my power. Aye, and he felt it too, for he had to come out of the mist and struggle with me. I held tight, and I thought I was going to win, for I didn't mean him to take any more of her life, till I saw his eyes. They burned into me, and my strength became like water. He slipped through it, and when I tried to cling to him, he raised me up and flung me down. There was a red cloud before me and a noise like thunder, and the mist seemed to steal away under the door.
His voice was becoming fainter, and his breath more stertorous. Van Helsing stood up instinctively. "We now know the worst," he said. "He is here, and we know his purpose. It may not be too late. Let us be armed, the same as we were the other night, but lose no time. There is not an instant to spare. There is no need to put out fear, nay, our conviction, into words. We share them in common." We all hurried and took from our rooms the same things that we had when we entered the Count's house. The Professor had his ready, and as we met in the corridor he pointed them significantly as he said, "They never leave me, and they shall not till this unhappy business is over. Be wise also, my friends, it is no common enemy that we deal with. Alas, alas, that dear Madam Mina should suffer." He stopped. His voice was breaking. I do not know if rage or terror predominated in my own heart. Outside the Harker's door we paused. Art and Quincy held back, and the latter said, "Should we disturb her?" "We must," said Van Helsing grimly. "If the door be locked, I shall break it in." "May it not frighten her terribly? It is unusual to break into a lady's room." "You are always right, but this is life and death. All chambers are like the doctor. And even were they not, they are all one to me tonight. Friend John, when I turn the handle, if the door does not open, do you put your shoulder down and shove, and you too, my friends. Now." He turned the handle as he spoke, but the door did not yield. We threw ourselves against it. With a crash it burst open, and we almost fell headlong into the room. The Professor did actually fall, and we saw him across, and he gathered himself up from his hands and knees. What I saw appalled me. I felt my hair raise like bristles on the back of my neck, and my heart seemed to stand still. The moonlight was so bright that through the thick yellow blind the room was light enough to see. On the bed beside the window lay Jonathan Harker, his face flushed, breathing heavily as though in a stupor. Kneeling on the edge of the bed facing outwards was the white-clad figure of his wife. By her side stood a tall, thin man, clad in black. His face was turned from us, but the instant we saw it we all recognized the Count. In every way, even to the scar on his forehead. With his left hand he held both Mrs. Harker's hands, keeping them away with her arms at full tension, his right hand gripping her by the back of the neck, forcing her face down on his bosom. Her white nightdress was smeared with blood, and a thin stream trickled down the man's bare breast, which was shown by his torn-open dress. The attitude of the two had a terrible resemblance to a child forcing a kitten's nose into a saucer of milk to trample it to drink. As we burst to the room, the Count turned his face. The hellish look it had described seemed to leap into it. His eyes flamed with red, devilish passion. The great nostrils of the white aquiline nose opened wide and quivered at the edges. The white, sharp teeth behind the full lips of blood-dripping mouth champed together like those of a wild beast. With a wrench, he threw his victim back upon the bed. As though hurled from a height, he turned and sprang at us, but by this time the Professor had gained his feet and was holding towards him the envelope which contained the sacred wafer. The Count suddenly stopped, just as poor Lucy had done outside the tomb, and cowered back. Further and further back he cowered, as we, lifting our crucifixes, advanced. The moonlight suddenly failed, as a great black cloud sailed across the sky, and when the gaslight sprang up under Quincy's match, we saw nothing but a faint vapour. This, as we looked, trailed under the door, which, with the recoil from its bursting open, had swung back to its old position. Van Helsing, Art, and I moved forward to Mrs. Harker, who by this time had drawn her breath, which had given a scream so wild, so ear-piercing, so despairing, that it seemed to me now that it will ring in my ears to my dying day. For a few seconds she lay in her helpless attitude in disarray. Her face was ghastly, with a pallor which, accentuated by the blood smeared on her lips and cheeks and chin, from her throat trickled a thin stream of blood. Her eyes were mad with terror. Then she put before her face her poor crushed hands, which bore on their whiteness the red mark of the Count's terrible grip, and from behind them came a low, desolate wail, which made the terrible scream seem only the quick expression of endless grief. Van Helsing stepped forward and drew the coverlet gently over her body. Willstart, after looking at her face for an instant despairingly, ran out of the room. Van Helsing whispered to me, "Jonathan is in a stupor such as we know the vampire can produce. We can do nothing with poor Madam Mina for a few moments till she recovers herself. I must wake him." He dipped the end of his towel in cold water, and with it began to flick him on the face, his wife all the while holding her face between her hands and sobbing in a way that was heart-breaking to hear. I raised the blind, and looking out the window, it was much moonshine, and I could see Quincy Morris run across the lawn and hide himself in the shadow of a great yew tree. It puzzled me to think why he was doing this, but the instant I heard Harker's quick exclamation as he woke to partial consciousness and turned to the bed, on his face, as there might well be, was a look of wild amazement. He seemed dazed for a few seconds, then full of consciousness seemed to burst upon him all at once, and he started up. His wife was aroused by the quick movement and turned to him with her arms stretched out as though to embrace him. Instantly, however, she drew them in again, and putting her elbows together, held her hands before her face and shuddered till the bed beneath her shook.